DoodleBob, a classic SpongeBob character known for such iconic quotes as, while DoodleBob is most remembered for his slapstick cartoon violence and silly babbles, the reason his debut episode stood the test of time lies in something much deeper. And when the SpongeBob writers decided to bring back the evil Doodle, I feel they missed out on what actually made DoodleBob special. Chapter 1. Frankendoodle. The plot of Frankendoodle revolves around SpongeBob accidentally creating a dangerous monster after he draws DoodleBob using a magic pencil dropped from the surface world. So before we get into talking about this episode's plot, character arc, and lessons, I want to touch on what it means when a story uses a supernatural entity like DoodleBob, or a dragon, or a witch. These are entities that do not exist in our real world, so when they are used as a plot device in a story, they have to represent something that does exist in the real world. For example, the witch in Hansel and Gretel, while being a literal witch who eats children in the story, represents an adult who would do harm to children. The utility of using a witch instead of a regular person to tell this story is that it makes the story more entertaining and thus more likely to reach a wider audience and teach that lesson. Frankendoodle actually has two main supernatural elements, DoodleBob and the magic pencil. The magic pencil represents power. I mean, it can literally create life. DoodleBob represents what happens when you lose control of your power and it comes back to harm you or others. For example, if you were celebrating the 4th of July in the woods and you set off fireworks that caused a forest fire, that would compare to Frankendoodle, because the fireworks would be like the magic pencil and the forest fire would be like DoodleBob. And in both situations, you would learn the lesson, with great power comes great responsibility, which is one of the most important literary lessons out there. If you absorbed that lesson from watching a SpongeBob episode, then you may understand the danger of setting off those fireworks in the woods, preventing the forest fire from ever occurring in the first place. This is the real reason that stories like this are important. Another thing to consider when writing supernatural entities like the magic pencil and DoodleBob are the rules, which give two unique challenges on the part of the writer. One, having consistent rules, and two, communicating those rules to the audience. Frankendoodle excels in both of these. The episode opens on the artist at sea, who drops his pencil into the ocean where SpongeBob and Patrick find it. The first thing SpongeBob draws is a jellyfish, which gets up and flies away, establishing the rule that when something is drawn with the pencil, it comes to life. Since the pencil came from the surface world, it is easy to accept that this pencil is inexplicably magic, either because it's an actual magic pencil, or that the surface world pencils just become magic when they go underwater. No matter which explanation makes the most sense to you, the detail of the pencil coming from the surface world and the live-action segment of the artist at sea helps make it believable that this is in fact a magic pencil within the logic of this universe. Then Patrick draws a Squidward that starts to act all weird and then gets erased. Pop quiz. What did this accomplish other than being funny? 3, 2, 1. It taught the audience that the pencil can erase what it draws, meaning it has both the power to create and destroy. Then SpongeBob draws DoodleBob in order to play what he thinks would be a harmless prank on Squidward, but as soon as DoodleBob gets near Squidward, it attacks, showing that the entities drawn by the pencil are hostile. The bulk of the story revolves around SpongeBob having to deal with DoodleBob. After first confronting DoodleBob and erasing him, SpongeBob thinks he's won the day, only to be attacked by DoodleBob that night since he failed to erase his arm, which allows DoodleBob to redraw himself. The final fight raises the stakes by revealing that the eraser not only can erase things drawn by the pencil, but it can erase anything, including parts of SpongeBob's body. Then SpongeBob notices that DoodleBob gets trapped within paper, which allows SpongeBob to trap him within a book. In the final scene, it's stated that DoodleBob is happy in the paper because that's where he belongs, which gives the episode a much more morally complex narrative. I think this works really well with what I talked about earlier with all that stuff about what the episode represents. By having DoodleBob not really be evil, just an entity that was brought into the wrong place, it puts the responsibility regarding the destruction that took place in the episode on the shoulders of SpongeBob, who was the one to create him, rather than just having DoodleBob be some evil entity that attacked SpongeBob for no other reason than it's just evil. After trapping DoodleBob, SpongeBob and Patrick decide to send the magic pencil back up to the surface from which it came, showing SpongeBob completed his character arc of learning that the pencil was far too powerful for him to have. So that's Frankendoodle. Beyond being a funny episode filled with memorable quotes, the episode succeeds because of its thematic thematic density and its understanding of how to use its characters and its world to tell a real and compelling lesson. Because of this episode's success, DoodleBob became a major SpongeBob icon, and like all SpongeBob icons, the writers decided to bring it back in the newer seasons. While DoodleBob has had quite a few appearances since Frankendoodle, I want to focus more on its two more major non-cameo appearances. So let's take a look at the next major DoodleBob episode and see how it holds up compared to Frankendoodle. Chapter 2, Doodle Dimension. Doodle Dimension revolves around SpongeBob and Patrick getting trapped in a blank void and having to fight off DoodleBob. So remember all that stuff I said about how a supernatural entity is supposed to represent something that exists in the real world or else the story would ring hollow? Well, DoodleBob in this episode doesn't seem to represent anything other than some big scary thing that is dangerous. So when SpongeBob and Patrick get trapped in this white void after going into Sandy's dimension portal, they realize that they can draw on the ground with magic rules similar to how the magic pencil worked in Frankendoodle. At first, SpongeBob draws on the ground accidentally with his shoes, but then he just pulls the magic pencil out of his head. Okay, so the writers of this episode obviously didn't bother to watch Frankendoodle because the ending of Frankendoodle revolves around SpongeBob getting rid of the magic pencil. And SpongeBob doesn't get rid of the pencil just to get rid of it, or because he lost it, or because someone took it. No, SpongeBob gets rid of the magic pencil because he came to the moral conclusion that it was a power he should not have. I don't even care that him having it again doesn't make logical sense. That doesn't matter in a cartoon if it serves the story, but him still having the pencil doesn't make narrative sense because it goes against the very lesson he learned in Frankendoodle. Then SpongeBob draws DoodleBob, and surprise, surprise, it starts attacking them again. Did he learn nothing from the original episode? Also, wouldn't DoodleBob not be evil in the Doodle dimension? Like, the ending of Frankendoodle explains that DoodleBob acted the way it did because it was in a world that it didn't belong. But once it became trapped inside the piece of paper where it does belong, it became happy. So wouldn't the Doodle dimension be the inside of the paper? Wouldn't DoodleBob not be a threat here because this is the place that it's supposed to be? I wouldn't know because this episode doesn't establish the rules of its universe properly. Speaking of rules not being established, one of the things that SpongeBob does to try and fight DoodleBob is to draw doodle versions of some of his friends to fight alongside him. Now, when this happened, I thought that it would backfire and the doodle friends would attack SpongeBob because, you know, the established rule of the magic pencil is that when you draw something with it, it becomes hostile. But no, for some reason, only DoodleBob is hostile by default. But then, oh, it gets worse. Then, when the doodle friends attack DoodleBob, DoodleBob draws evil eyebrows on the doodle friends, and that makes them hostile. And look, on its own, that is not a bad rule. I only take issue with this plot point because it contradicts the previous rule. Before, it was anything that gets drawn is hostile. But now it's anything that gets drawn that looks like SpongeBob is hostile, and anything else that gets drawn is not hostile unless you draw evil eyebrows on it. And that falls flat to me because there's no explanation as to why something shaped like SpongeBob is specifically hostile. It makes no sense. There's not much else to say about the plot of this episode, as so much of it just revolves around action without substance. Eventually, they just kind of defeat DoodleBob because he grabs a balloon and flies away. Does this victory matter narratively? Like, DoodleBob is defeated on two separate occasions in Frankendoodle, and both have narrative weight to them. The first defeat is when SpongeBob erases DoodleBob. The meaning behind this defeat is that SpongeBob used the pencil, the thing that created DoodleBob, to destroy him, but it doesn't work, representing that even if you have hold of great power, sometimes that power isn't enough to rid yourself of a problem that you created with that power. The second and final defeat of DoodleBob is when he is trapped in the book, which has narrative weight because 1, it doesn't kill DoodleBob, instead sends him to a place where he belongs and can be happy, and 2, finally teaches SpongeBob that he shouldn't have the giant pencil. Now, with all this in mind, what does DoodleBob flying away on a balloon actually represent? Nothing. It represents nothing. The whole episode represents nothing. They just wanted to bring back DoodleBob because they saw him in a bunch of memes and best SpongeBob moments compilations and thought that "Nihoy minoy" is all you need for DoodleBob to work, but they ignored all of the complex narrative structure that made the original episode actually work. So how do we fix this episode? First off, we need a character flaw for SpongeBob or Patrick to overcome throughout the episode. In Frankendoodle, that flaw was SpongeBob's flippant use of a powerful object. Doodle Dimension could have taken a similar approach, but instead of the magic pencil being the source of the power, it's the Doodle Dimension itself. I would just cut the magic pencil from the episode entirely for the reasons I mentioned earlier, and I would instead have SpongeBob's shoes be the only object that creates the drawings in the world. Since Patrick doesn't have shoes, he would ask for one of SpongeBob's other shoes, to which SpongeBob would refuse, not trusting Patrick with the power. Oh yeah, I would also change the beginning to have it be Patrick's fault that they got stuck in Sandy's teleporter, rather than the original episode, which had both SpongeBob and Patrick act almost equally irresponsible. If SpongeBob blamed Patrick for them getting stuck there, it not only establishes Patrick's character flaw as irresponsibility, it also establishes SpongeBob's character flaw as distrustful, and they can both learn to overcome these character flaws as they come into conflict and resolution. So within my rewrite, Patrick would somehow steal one of SpongeBob's shoes, and the two would create increasingly powerful objects to fight each other with. Kind of similar to the plot of Sandcastles in the Sand, but while Sandcastles in the Sand is about pride, Doodle Dimension could have been about responsibility and distrust, and the way that I tie that theme together is through DoodleBob. Throughout my rewritten version of Doodle Dimension, DoodleBob would loom in the minds of SpongeBob and Patrick, with each of them threatening to create DoodleBob in order to fight against the other, with them knowing just how dangerous DoodleBob is. Basically, it would be mutually assured destruction, but instead of a nuclear bomb, it's DoodleBob. So yeah, Doodle Dimension was a gigantic downgrade from Frankendoodle, but what about the next DoodleBob episode? Chapter 3, Curse of the Were-doodle. Curse of the Were-doodle is, at the time of this recording, the most recent DoodleBob episode. Something that makes this episode different from any other DoodleBob episode is that it actually has SpongeBob turn into DoodleBob once he is bit by DoodleBob and afflicted by the Curse of the Were-doodle. So then there's a bunch of scenes where SpongeBob is at a place like boating school or the Krusty Krab when the full moon hits him and he turns into the Were-doodle and terrorizes that particular location. What the episode is missing is a specific character flaw that caused SpongeBob to get afflicted by this curse and what the curse actually represents. My issue with this episode is similar to my issue with Squidward's Tough Break, which I covered in my Salty Spitoon video, which you should totally check out, by the way, link in the description. In Squidward's Tough Break, Squidward becomes a tough guy because he gets hit in the head and loses his memory, and in Curse of the Were-doodle, SpongeBob becomes a monster at the full moon because he gets bit by DoodleBob. The problem with both plot points is that our character change is driven by something that they didn't choose, and they have no control over, so it robs the protagonist of the ability to make actual decisions. And if your protagonist isn't making decisions, then the story can't teach a lesson, because lessons are all about making choices. A werewolf as a supernatural entity represents the conflict between our desire to be civilized and organized and our primal animalistic instincts. Turning into a werewolf represents giving in to these base desires. While in a literal sense, the character loses control because of the curse that turns them into a werewolf, in a narrative sense, that loss of control represents the urges that that character would otherwise suppress in civilized society. The writers of this episode just didn't understand this. They thought a werewolf is when you turn into a wolf, and filled the episode to the brim with these long, drawn-out slapstick scenes of the Were-doodle wreaking havoc to avoid actually engaging with a real story. A fix to these problems would be to have SpongeBob have some kind of frustration at some of the monotony of his life before he becomes the Were-doodle. So that way, the Were-doodle represents him venting some of his frustrations at stuff like not passing his driving test or getting overworked at the Krusty Krab. I know he's generally pretty positive about the Krusty Krab, so we'd have to tweak the scene a little bit to maybe have him get a particularly difficult customer or a difficult order or something to have him get extra stressed. Then give SpongeBob a little bit of awareness that he becomes the Were-doodle. It can still be mostly out of his control and a result of the curse, but if he's aware that he becomes the Were-doodle, he can try to resist it and then eventually get overtaken, which narratively represents someone getting overwhelmed by the monotony of civilized life, which is exactly what a werewolf actually represents. Then at the end, when the town hunts down the Were-doodle, SpongeBob would join them, not because he's unaware that he is the Were-doodle, but because it's the only way he can avoid taking responsibility for being the Were-doodle. And that could be the stressor that makes the final Were-doodle transformation make sense. Now to clarify, I'm not saying that the stressor should be the thing that turns SpongeBob into the Were-doodle. The moon, in a literal sense, still turns him into the Were-doodle, but by having these other stressors happen at around the same time the moon causes him to transform, we have both literal and narrative reasons for SpongeBob becoming a Were-doodle. As the episode stands, there is only a literal reason he becomes the Were-doodle, and as I've already said multiple times in this video, if your supernatural entity doesn't represent something real, it falls flat. I also want to touch on the ending of Curse of the Were-doodle, where DoodleBob shows up and is just kind of good now, and also has a background fish wife. Okay, that's quite a development. So I don't actually hate this as a concept, but I do think that this episode was a bad place to establish this, because as it stands, this doesn't make any sense. After all, DoodleBob does not belong in this world. It makes him hostile and violent to be here. It was cruel of SpongeBob to create him, and only by trapping him in a piece of paper where he belongs can he be happy. Or is it? I mean, after all, it's a good lesson to teach that someone who is different from you and from a different place can assimilate into your society and live a decent life. That's actually a fine direction for DoodleBob to go in. DoodleBob redemption arc, I'm all here for it. Problem is, all of this DoodleBob redemption happened off screen and was just kind of quickly revealed in this last scene in order to tie in this episode's plot. Honestly, the best non-Frankendoodle DoodleBob episode would be the one where DoodleBob assimilates into Bikini Bottom and finds a wife, and that episode doesn't exist. So unfortunately, of the 3 DoodleBob episodes, one is good and the other 2 are both pretty trash. And the good one is from classic SpongeBob and the bad ones are from modern SpongeBob. Go ahead, call me a sponge boomer in the comments, it's fine. I'm not thrilled with this conclusion. I do like to give modern SpongeBob the benefit of the doubt, but these other 2 DoodleBob episodes just did not understand how to properly write a supernatural character into a story. And because of that, I'm sorry to say that DoodleBob probably would have been better off if they just let his story end on this piece of paper. After all, Frankendoodle is a really solid, full story, and a little poorly drawn SpongeBob who says, beep bop beep bob, while it made for one knockout episode, probably isn't the kind of character who was worth ever bringing back. Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you want to support me, I've got a Patreon and channel memberships, and make sure to check out my other videos and my gaming channel. See you next time.